Rashid Al-Zahrani had built an empire on certainty. At 62, the Kuwaiti oil magnate commanded boardrooms across 3 continents with the same unwavering confidence that had carried him from his grandfather's modest trading company to the pinnacle of Middle Eastern business. His salt and pepper beard was always perfectly trimmed, his white dish dasher immaculate, and his dark eyes had never wavered from any challenge, until the night his carefully constructed world shattered over. Appetizers at Le Bernardin in Manhattan. He'd brought Celeste, his elegant 42-year-old companion, to celebrate closing a landmark deal. They were seated at his usual corner table, champagne already poured, when he saw her. Margaret, his ex-wife of 15 years, the woman he'd divorced just 8 months ago after a bitter argument about children and family obligations. She was radiant, glowing in a way he'd never seen during their marriage, her hand resting protectively on a visible baby bump, laughing at something the distinguished silver-haired man beside her was saying. The man's hand covered hers with obvious tenderness. Rashid's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips as 40 years of carefully maintained emotional control evaporated like morning dew in the desert sun. Margaret Walsh had walked into Le Bernardin feeling genuinely happy for the first time in 2 years. At 58, she'd never imagined she'd be starting over, much less expecting. Her first child, the baby inside her, wasn't planned, and certainly wasn't what she'd envisioned when she'd married Rashid 15 years ago, hoping to build a blended family with his grown children who'd never quite accepted her. But life had a way of surprising you, and Dr. Richard Morrison, the widowed cardiologist sitting across from her, had brought unexpected joy into her carefully ordered world of art gallery management and quiet evening walks. Richard was 63, kind, present in ways Rashid had never been, and when she'd discovered the pregnancy 3 months into their relationship, his immediate joy had been infectious. Now, wearing a flowing emerald dress that accommodated her 5-month bump, she felt beautiful and cherished. Richard was telling her about his daughter's upcoming wedding when she saw Rashid's face across the restaurant, and her joy froze into complicated recognition. Rashid couldn't tear his eyes away from the tableau. Margaret looked softer somehow, her auburn hair longer than she'd worn it during their marriage, cascading over shoulders that seemed more relaxed. During their 15 years together, she'd maintained the perfect corporate wife appearance, elegant, controlled, appropriate for every business dinner and charity gala. But there'd always been a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that he'd attributed to the stress of managing her Tribeca gallery. Now that tension was gone, replaced by a glow that made her look 10 years younger. The pregnancy was obvious. She must be at least 5 months along, which meant she'd gotten pregnant almost immediately after their divorce was finalized. The thought sent a spike of something dark and painful through his chest. Celeste was saying something about the menu, her French-accented voice a pleasant murmur, but Rashid couldn't focus. All he could see was Margaret's hand resting on that bump, protective and tender, while another man, silver-haired, distinguished, clearly American, looked at her with undisguised adoration. Celeste Laurent noticed the precise moment she lost Rashid's attention. After 6 months of dinners, theater performances, and carefully choreographed public appearances, she'd become quite adept at reading the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The Kuwaiti businessman was nothing if not consistent, controlled, generous, emotionally distant in a way that suited her perfectly. She wasn't interested in messy emotions or complicated commitments. At 42, divorced twice, she'd found the arrangement ideal: companionship without demands, luxury without love, and the freedom to maintain her own life as a fashion consultant. But now she watched his face transform as he stared across the restaurant at a pregnant redhead, and she recognized the look. It was the same expression her second husband had worn when he'd seen his ex-wife at their daughter's graduation. Hunger, regret, longing. The realization settled over her like expensive perfume, cloying and suddenly unwelcome. She set down her menu with careful precision. "Who is she?" Celeste asked quietly, her French accent more pronounced when she was upset. Rashid didn't answer. He was already rising from his chair. Margaret's hand tightened on Richard's as she watched Rashid approach their table. Everything Everything about him was painfully familiar, the way he moved with absolute confidence through crowded spaces, the set of his shoulders beneath the pristine white dishdasha, the traditional red and white checked gutra on his head held by a black agal. During their marriage, she'd loved watching him navigate both worlds, traditional Arab businessman in his native attire and global executive in bespoke suits. Now, seeing him stride toward her table, she felt 15 years of complicated emotions surge up. Their divorce had been brutal, filled with accusations and hurt. She'd wanted children, had begged him to consider adoption or surrogacy when his adult children from his first marriage made clear they wouldn't accept half-siblings. Rashid had refused, insisting his family legacy was complete, that at 62 he was too old to start over with babies. The final argument, just days before she'd signed the papers, had been devastating. Now here he stood, staring at her pregnant belly with an expression she couldn't quite read. Margaret. Rashid's voice was carefully controlled, but she heard the strain beneath it. "I didn't expect to see you here." His dark eyes moved from her face to her stomach, then to Richard, who'd half risen from his chair with the instinctive protectiveness of a man aware he was in potentially hostile territory. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The formality was vintage Rashid. Always proper, always maintaining appearances, even when his world was crumbling. Margaret could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the only tell that he was anything but perfectly composed. Behind him, a striking, dark-haired woman in an elegant black dress watched from his table, her expression unreadable. The mistress, Margaret thought with surprising detachment. She'd heard rumors through their overlapping social circles. A French fashion consultant, beautiful and sophisticated, exactly the kind of uncomplicated companion Rashid would choose after their messy divorce. Richard Morrison had been a cardiologist for 37 years, which meant he'd developed excellent instincts about when hearts were in danger, including his own. He'd loved his late wife Patricia deeply, and after her death from breast cancer 5 years ago, he'd assumed his romantic life was over. Meeting Margaret at a hospital charity auction 8 months ago had been unexpected. Falling in love with her had been inevitable. Now, extending his hand to the man who was clearly her ex-husband, Richard felt that old protective instinct surge. "Richard Morrison," he said evenly, his handshake firm. "You must be Rashid. Margaret's told me about you." It was partially true. She'd told him about the marriage, the painful divorce, the children who'd never accepted her. What she hadn't told him was that this man still clearly affected her. He could see it in the way her breathing had changed, the subtle shift in her posture. Richard squeezed her hand gently under the table, a quiet reminder. "I'm here. You're not alone." Rashid felt the younger man's handshake like a physical challenge. Richard Morrison was everything he wasn't. Tall, silver-haired, classically American, handsome in the way of men who'd never had to fight for anything. Doctors, Rashid thought with irrational bitterness. They always played the hero. "I'm familiar with Dr. Morrison," Rashid said stiffly, retrieving information his mind had automatically catalogued. "Columbia Presbyterian, cardiac surgery. Your research on valve replacement techniques is impressive." It was a power play demonstrating knowledge, establishing that he'd done his homework, except he hadn't. His mind had simply filed away the connection when Margaret had mentioned months ago during one of their awkward property settlement meetings that she was seeing someone kind, she'd said, someone who actually wants to be present. The words had stung more than he'd admitted. Now, staring at the evidence of just how present this man had been, Rashid felt something crack inside his carefully maintained facade. "When are you due?" The words came out before Rashid could stop them, his eyes fixed on Margaret's belly. He saw her stiffen, saw Richard's protective hand move to her shoulder. The baby was a boy, Rashid decided, based on the way she was carrying, low and compact, the way his first wife Layla had carried their sons. The realization that Margaret was having the child she'd begged him for with another man felt like a physical blow. During their marriage, she'd brought him brochures for adoption agencies, research on surrogacy, passionate arguments about how they could build a family together despite his grown children's objections. He'd refused every time, insisting that at his age, with his legacy secure, there was no reason to complicate their lives. What a fool he'd been. What a stubborn, prideful fool. Margaret lifted her chin, that gesture of defiance he'd always found both infuriating and attractive. "April," she said quietly. "A girl." The correction was gentle but firm, and Rashid absorbed it like a punch to the solar plexus. A daughter. Margaret was having a daughter with this man, this doctor who looked at her like she hung the moon. "We're very excited," Richard added, his hand still protectively on Margaret's shoulder. The possessive gesture wasn't lost on Rashid. This wasn't a casual relationship. This was serious, committed, the kind of partnership Rashid had taken for granted during his marriage. "Congratulations," he heard himself say, the word tasting like ash. Behind him, he could feel Celeste's eyes boring into his back, probably wondering why he was still standing at his ex-wife's table, making small talk about babies and due dates. The answer was simple. He couldn't move. His feet seemed rooted to the restaurant's expensive carpeting. His entire world reduced to the sight of Margaret's hand resting on her pregnant belly. The belly that should have been his. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Margaret took pity on him. Despite everything, the bitter arguments, the painful divorce, the years of feeling invisible in their marriage, she couldn't quite hate him. Rashid had never been deliberately cruel. He'd been absent, yes, emotionally unavailable, certainly, obsessed with his business empire and maintaining his adult children's approval to the exclusion of her needs. But he'd never been mean. "How are Khalid and Faisal?" she asked, referencing his sons from his first marriage. The olive branch was deliberate. During their marriage, she'd tried so hard to connect with them, organizing family dinners they'd cancel last minute, remembering birthdays they'd forget, attempting to bridge a gap they had no interest in closing. His daughter Noor had been slightly warmer, but even she'd maintained a careful distance. They'd made it clear Margaret was temporary, an interloper in their father's life, and eventually their coldness had won. Rashid's expression softened marginally. "Khalid just made me a grandfather again, his third." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken irony. During their marriage, whenever Margaret had brought up children, Rashid had pointed to his 5 grandchildren as proof he'd done his duty to family legacy. Now there were 6, apparently, and Margaret was about to become a mother herself at 58. The universe had a dark sense of humor. "Noor is engaged," he continued, "to a banker from Dubai. The wedding will be in Kuwait City next spring." The words were automatic, social pleasantries, but his eyes never left Margaret's face. She looked different, happy. The realization was both wonderful and devastating. During their 15 years together, had she ever looked this content? He couldn't remember a single moment when her eyes had held this soft light, this unmistakable glow of genuine joy. Richard felt the strange intimacy of the moment and knew he should feel jealous or threatened, but mostly he felt sad. Sad for whatever had been lost between these two people. Sad for the obvious regret radiating from Rashid Al-Zahrani like heat from desert sand. "Margaret's gallery is doing wonderfully," Richard offered, trying to shift the conversation to safer ground. "She just secured representation for a promising young Syrian artist. The opening is next month." He squeezed her hand gently, proud of her. Accomplishments, wanting this man to know that Margaret was thriving, that she'd built a life beyond their failed marriage. Margaret shot him a grateful look, and Rashid noticed the exchange. There was communication there, the kind of silent understanding that only came from real intimacy. How long had it been since he and Margaret had shared such moments? Years, perhaps. Maybe never. Celeste Laurent had excellent survival instincts. You didn't navigate 2 messy divorces and build a successful fashion consulting business without learning when to cut your losses. Watching Rashid stand frozen at his ex-wife's table, she made her decision. With practiced grace, she rose from their table, collected her Hermes clutch, and walked over to the little group. "Rashid," she said smoothly, her French accent adding elegance to the interruption. "I'm afraid I'm not feeling well. The headache I mentioned earlier is getting worse." It was a lie, delivered with perfect conviction. "Perhaps we should postpone our dinner." She extended her hand to Margaret and Richard with cosmopolitan charm. "I'm Celeste Laurent. I hope you enjoy your evening." warning. The message was clear. She was extracting herself with dignity and tact, giving Rashid whatever emotional space he needed to deal with this unexpected encounter, and removing herself from what was obviously a complicated situation. Rashid turned to Celeste, grateful and guilty in equal measure. She was giving him an out, and they both knew it. More than that, she was demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence and grace that he'd failed to show in his own marriage. "I'll take you home," he said automatically, but Celeste shook her head. "I'll take a cab. You should stay. Sort whatever this is out." She kissed his cheek lightly, a gesture of affection and farewell. "Call me next week if you'd like." The implication was clear. Or don't. The arrangement had always been casual. If he needed to deal with ghosts from his past, she wouldn't stand in his way. Celeste nodded to Margaret and Richard once more, then walked toward the exit with her head high, leaving Rashid standing awkwardly by their table, suddenly without a buffer or excuse. Margaret watched the French woman leave with a mixture of admiration and complicated emotions. The mistress, except that wasn't fair. Celeste Laurent wasn't a mistress in any traditional sense. Margaret and Rashid had been divorced for 8 months. He was free to see whoever he wanted, just as she was free to build a life with Richard. But seeing him here in this restaurant with another woman had stirred up feelings she'd thought were safely buried. She looked up at Rashid, still standing there looking lost, and made a decision. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked quietly. Richard's hand tightened on hers, a silent question, but she squeezed back reassuringly. Just for a moment. To the universe's credit, Richard Morrison was secure enough in himself and their relationship to simply nod. He pulled out the empty chair at their table. "We haven't ordered yet," he said to Rashid. "A peace offering. Join us for a drink at least." Sitting down at the table felt surreal. Rashid found himself across from his ex-wife and her new partner in a restaurant where he'd dined dozens of times during their marriage, discussing pleasantries as if the situation weren't absolutely bizarre. The waiter appeared confused by the changed dynamics, but professional enough not to comment. Rashid ordered cognac. He needed something stronger than champagne, while Margaret sipped sparkling water and Richard nursed a scotch. The silence that fell after the waiter departed wasn't hostile exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken words and questions. Finally, Richard broke it. "I'm going to excuse myself for a moment," he said, rising from his chair. "Give you two a chance to talk." The gesture was generous, the kind of emotional maturity Rashid had to admire, even as it made him feel worse about himself. Richard kissed Margaret's temple, a casual intimacy that spoke volumes, then headed toward the restroom. "You don't have to do this," Rashid said once they were alone, his hands wrapped around his cognac glass like a lifeline. "I'm sure this is awkward." The understatement made Margaret laugh, a soft sound that reminded him of evenings early in their marriage, when things had still been good. "Awkward doesn't begin to cover it," she agreed, "but I think we probably need to clear the air. We're going to run into each other, Rashid. New York isn't that big, especially in our circles." She was right, of course. They moved in overlapping social worlds, charity galas, museum openings, business dinners. Avoiding each other indefinitely wasn't practical. "How long?" Rashid asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd seen her belly. "How long have you and the doctor been together?" The answer mattered more than it should have. Margaret studied him for a moment, trying to read the emotion behind the question. Was he hurt, angry, just curious? With Rashid, it was always hard to tell. He'd spent so many years maintaining perfect control that she'd often felt like she was married to a very sophisticated robot. "We met at a hospital fundraiser 8 months ago," she said finally, "about 2 weeks after our divorce was finalized. We started dating casually, got serious around month 3, and I discovered I was pregnant at 4 months. She watched his face for reactions, saw the slight tightening around his eyes. "It wasn't planned, Rashid. I'm 58 years old. I'd assumed that door was closed." The memory of that doctor's appointment still made her laugh. The shock, the disbelief, then the sudden, overwhelming joy. But Richard was happy about it. Immediately, unconditionally happy. "And I realized I'd spent 15 years asking you for something," Richard gave me without hesitation, enthusiasm about sharing a life with me. The words hit Rashid like physical blows. each one precisely targeted at his carefully maintained defenses. Enthusiasm, sharing a life. How long had it been since he'd shown Margaret genuine enthusiasm about anything other than his quarterly earnings reports? He thought back over their marriage, the elegant dinners where he'd discussed business while she'd smiled and played the perfect hostess, the charity events where she'd networked for her gallery while he'd worked his contacts, the separate bedrooms they'd eventually maintained because his sleep schedule was so unpredictable. When had they stopped being partners and become simply two people sharing an address? "I failed you," he said quietly, the admission costing him. "In our marriage, I failed you." It was the closest he'd come to apologizing during their entire divorce proceedings, and he saw surprise flicker across Margaret's face. "Yes," Margaret said simply, because there was no point in sugarcoating it anymore. "You did. But I failed you too, Rashid. I spent so much energy trying to get you to see me, to prioritize our relationship over your business empire and your adult children's approval, that I stopped seeing you. I stopped asking what you needed or wanted. I just kept pushing for children, for a family, for something that maybe you genuinely didn't want." She'd spent months in therapy after the divorce working through these realizations, and now they came out clear and honest. "You told me from the beginning that your children were grown, your legacy secure. I thought I could change your mind. That was unfair of me." The admission brought its own relief. They'd both been wrong. They'd both hurt each other. That didn't make the pain less, but it made it more understandable. Rashid absorbed this, turning the cognac glass in his hands. "Did you love him right away?" The question was raw, vulnerable in a way he never allowed himself to be. "Morrison, when you met him, did you just know?" He needed to understand how she'd moved on so quickly, how she'd found with someone else what he'd apparently never given her. Margaret considered the question carefully. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't love him right away. I was angry and hurt and frankly damaged from our divorce. Richard was patient. He let me set the pace. He asked questions about my life and actually listened to the answers. He remembered small things, my coffee order, the name of my assistant, the Syrian artist I was excited about, little things you used to do when we were dating but stopped once we married." She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "Love grew slowly, and then one day I realized I was excited to see him, that I wanted to share my day with him, that being with him made me happy." Is that what you wanted to know? What Rashid wanted to know was whether he'd lost something irreplaceable or simply something that had never really been his to begin with. Sitting across from Margaret, seeing her glow with happiness and impending motherhood, he felt like a man who discovered buried treasure after selling the land. "I'm 62 years old," he said finally, "and I just realized I don't know how to have a genuine relationship. I've been married twice, first to Layla for 30 years, which was arranged by our families and became more of a business partnership than a marriage, then to you for 15 years, which I approached like a merger and acquisition. The analogy was apt and painful. Celeste is lovely, but what we have isn't real. It's convenient and uncomplicated and emotionally safe, which is exactly why it won't last." The cognac burned going down, but not as much as the truth. Margaret felt an unexpected wave of compassion. This wasn't the controlled, confident businessman she'd been married to. This was a man confronting his own limitations, and it couldn't be easy. "Rashid," she said gently, "you're not incapable of love. You love your children fiercely. You loved your mother. I saw how devastated you were when she died. You have the capacity for deep emotion. You just learned somewhere along the way that showing it was dangerous or weak." She thought about this often during their marriage, wondering what had hardened this man who occasionally showed glimpses of warmth before retreating behind his walls. "Your father," she guessed. Was he the kind of man who believed business and family were separate, emotion something to be controlled? It was a shot in the dark, but she saw the truth of it in his eyes. "My father built an empire through ruthless discipline," Rashid said, surprised to find himself sharing this. Emotions were weaknesses to be exploited by competitors. Love made you vulnerable. Family was about duty and legacy, not feelings. His father, Hamza Al-Zahrani, had been a legend in Kuwait, building the family business from a small trading company to an oil and shipping empire. But he'd also been cold, demanding, quick with criticism and slow with praise. He died when I was 35, and I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to earn his approval while building my own walls exactly like his. My marriage to Layla was what he wanted, a proper Kuwaiti match, good family, connections, sons to carry on the name. We learned to respect each other, but love, he shook his head, that wasn't part of the arrangement. And then I met you, and I thought I could do things differently, but I fell into the same patterns. Work first, duty second, everything else distant third. Richard returned to find them deep in conversation, Margaret's expression thoughtful and Rashid looking more vulnerable than Richard had expected. The cardiologist in him recognized the signs of someone confronting painful truths about themselves. He'd seen it in cardiac patients facing lifestyle changes after heart attacks, that moment when denial cracked and reality flooded in. "Everything okay?" he asked, sliding back into his seat and taking Margaret's hand. The gesture was both protective and reassuring. Margaret smiled at him, and Richard felt the warmth of that smile clear through his chest. "We're talking," she said simply. "Actually talking, maybe for the first time in years." She turned to Rashid. "You asked how long Richard and I have been together. Let me ask you, when did we stop talking? During our marriage, when did conversations become just logistics and social calendars?" The question struck Rashid as fundamentally important. He tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had during their marriage, not about dinner parties or business associates or her gallery, but about thoughts, feelings, dreams. The memory wouldn't come. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe year 5, maybe earlier." It was a devastating realization. They'd spent a decade as virtual strangers sharing an address. "Did you try to tell me?" he asked, needing to know. "Did you try to reach me, and I just didn't listen?" He suspected he knew the answer, and it wouldn't be flattering. Margaret nodded slowly. "Many times. I'd try to have conversations about us, our future, what we wanted. You'd listen politely, then change the subject to something safer, work, events, your children. Eventually I stopped trying. It seemed easier to just coexist." Richard squeezed Margaret's hand, understanding now some of the wounds she'd brought into their relationship. She'd needed more than coexistence. She'd needed partnership, engagement, presence. "Rashid," he said carefully, "I don't know what your intention is here, but Margaret and I are building a life together. We're having a baby. We're committed." It wasn't a challenge exactly, but it was a line in the sand. "If you're here looking for closure, that's fine. If you're looking for something else, I need you to be honest about it." The words were direct, but not unkind. Richard had been through enough in his own life, losing Patricia, rebuilding after grief, to recognize a man at a crossroads, but he also needed to protect what he and Margaret had built. Rashid appreciated the directness. American men, he'd found, tended to be clearer about their intentions than the elaborate dance of Middle Eastern courtesy he'd grown up with. "I don't know what I'm looking for," he admitted. "I saw Margaret across the restaurant, saw her pregnant and happy with another man, and something broke inside me. Not because I want her back, I'm not that delusional, but because I realized what I lost through my own stubbornness and emotional cowardice." He looked at Margaret directly. "You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved someone who showed up fully, not just physically, but emotionally. Someone who built dreams with you instead of maintaining separate lives under the same roof. I'm glad you found that with Richard." "I am. But seeing it made me confront the fact that I'm 62 years old, and I've never given anyone that kind of partnership. Not Layla, not you, and certainly not Celeste." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. This was the man she'd needed during their marriage. Honest, vulnerable, willing to examine himself. But he'd arrived 15 years too late. "Rashid," she said softly, "you can learn. You can choose to be different, but you have to want it for yourself, not because you've seen what you lost. The work of becoming emotionally available, of learning to show up for someone, that's hard work, daily work. It means dismantling walls you've spent decades building." She knew this personally. Her own therapy had involved confronting her patterns, choosing emotionally, Unavailable men, prioritizing their needs over her own, losing herself in relationships while resentfully waiting to be seen. I couldn't change you. You have to do that work yourself, if it's work you even want to do. What if I don't know how? Rashid asked, the question genuine. What if I'm too old, too set in my ways? The fear behind the question was real. He'd spent 62 years being one kind of person. Could he become someone different? Was change even possible at his age? Richard, who'd been listening quietly, leaned forward. Rashid, I'm 63. I lost my wife 5 years ago and assumed I was done with love. Then I met Margaret, and I had to choose, stay comfortable in my grief and solitude, or risk being vulnerable again. It scared the hell out of me. He laughed softly at the memory. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't. I stayed. I showed up. I asked questions. I listened to answers. I let myself feel things even when it was uncomfortable. That's all you need to do. Show up. Be present. Actually feel your feelings instead of managing them like a portfolio. The conversation continued for another hour. 3 unlikely dinner companions picking at appetizers they'd eventually ordered, talking about marriages and mistakes, regrets and redemption. Rashid found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Kuwait, the pressure of being the eldest son, the expectations that had shaped him into someone who valued achievement over connection. Margaret talked about her own family, Irish Catholic, working-class Boston, where emotions ran hot but were quickly forgiven. Her father had been demonstrative, her mother warm, and she'd chosen men who were the opposite, trying to heal something she didn't understand. Richard shared stories of his marriage to Patricia, the joy and the eventual grief, learning to let people in after loss. The 3 of them were unlikely companions, brought together by fate, and bad timing in a French restaurant in Manhattan. Your children, Margaret said eventually, circling back to a topic that had been central to their marriage's failure. Khalid, Faisal, Noor, do they know you're struggling? She'd always suspected Rashid's relationship with his adult children was more complicated than he let on. They'd been in their 20s when their mother, Layla, had died, and Rashid's remarriage just 2 years later to an American woman had clearly been difficult for them. But Rashid had never wanted to acknowledge the tension, always insisting his children would adjust, would accept Margaret given time. They never had. Now, Rashid shook his head. We don't talk about personal things. We talk about business, weddings, grandchildren, surface things. The admission was painful. They think I'm fine, strong, in control. That's who I've always been for them. Maybe they need to see you're human, Richard suggested gently. My daughter Emily is 35. When Patricia died, I tried to be strong for her, to not burden her with my grief. It was my son-in-law who finally told me I was making it worse, that Emily needed to see me grieve, to know it was okay to fall apart sometimes. Once I let her in, our relationship deepened. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She became someone I could actually talk to. He paused, considering his words. Your children are in their 40s, right? They're adults. They can handle knowing. Their father struggles sometimes. It might even bring you closer. The suggestion was met with skepticism in Rashid's eyes, decades of patriarchal conditioning evident in his doubt. But there was also curiosity, a small opening that hadn't existed before. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to thin out. Late diners departed, leaving the 3 of them in their corner, talking like old friends rather than the complicated triangle they actually were. Eventually, Margaret stifled a yawn, and Richard immediately stood. We should get you home, he said, his hand moving to help her from her chair with the automatic care of someone attuned to his partner's needs. Margaret was 5 months pregnant and clearly tired, though she'd never complain. Rashid watched the interaction, the way Richard anticipated her needs, the way Margaret leaned into his support naturally, and felt both envy and genuine happiness for her. This was what she deserved all along, a partner who saw her, who anticipated her comfort, who made her needs a priority. Thank you for talking with me, Rashid said as they prepared to leave. I know this wasn't how you expected your evening to go. The understatement hung in the air, And Margaret laughed softly. No, it certainly wasn't. But I'm glad we did. I'm glad we finally had an honest conversation. She hesitated, then reached out and squeezed Rashid's hand briefly. I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. You deserve happiness too, Rashid. You just have to be willing to do the work to get there. The touch was brief but genuine. Forgiveness offered, if not for their failed marriage, then at least for the possibility of moving forward. Richard extended his hand as well. Take care of yourself, he said simply. There was no animosity in it, just one man acknowledging another's pain with compassion. Rashid watched them leave, Margaret's hand tucked into Richard's arm, their heads bent together. In quiet conversation, the restaurant seemed emptier without them, and he sat alone at the table, nursing cold cognac and processing everything that had been said. His phone buzzed, a text from Celeste. Hope you're okay. Take care of yourself. Even in departure, she was gracious, emotionally intelligent in ways he'd failed to appreciate. He thought about calling her, explaining, maybe trying to salvage whatever they'd had. But the truth was, she deserved better too. She deserved someone who could give her more than surface-level companionship and expensive dinners. Someone who could actually show up emotionally, not just physically. Rashid paid the bill with a credit card that bore his company's name, that symbol of success that had defined him for so long, and walked out into the Manhattan night feeling more lost than he had in decades. The next few days passed in a blur of business meetings and social obligations, but Rashid couldn't shake the conversation. With Margaret, he found himself distracted during board meetings, his mind wandering to questions about emotional availability and vulnerability. His assistant noticed, but said nothing. She'd worked for him for 15 years and knew when to give him space. Finally, on a Wednesday afternoon, Rashid did something he'd never done before. He called his eldest son, Khalid, and asked if they could have lunch. Not a business lunch, just lunch. The pause on the other end of the line was telling. Is everything all right, father? Khalid asked, clearly confused. They had their monthly family dinners, carefully choreographed affairs at Rashid's penthouse where everyone was polite and no one said anything real. But a spontaneous lunch request? That was unprecedented. Everything is fine, Rashid assured him. I just thought it would be nice to talk, just the two of us. Another pause, then Khalid agreed, suggesting a Lebanese restaurant in Midtown. They met the next day, Khalid arriving in a tailored suit, looking every inch the successful investment banker, a younger version of Rashid himself. They ordered mechanically, hummus, tabbouleh, grilled lamb, and made small talk about Khalid's children and his work. Finally, Rashid set down his fork and decided to try something different. Tell me about your marriage, he said. You and Yasmin, how do you make it work? The question clearly surprised Khalid. What do you mean? He asked carefully. You know, Yasmin, we've been married 12 years. You were at the wedding. The deflection was automatic, and Rashid recognized it because he taught his son that move. I know, Rashid persisted, but I mean really. How do you connect with her? How do you stay emotionally present when work is demanding and there are children and obligations? He saw confusion flicker across Khalid's face, then something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. I talk to her, Khalid said finally. Every night. After the children are in bed, we have tea together and talk about our days. Not just logistics, what we felt, what frustrated us, what made us happy. Yasmin insists on it. She says without that time, we're just roommates managing a household. He paused, studying his father. Why are you asking this? The question was gentle but direct, and Rashid appreciated it. Because I've been married twice and I realize I never learned how to actually be married, how to be a partner, and I'm wondering if it's too late to learn. Khalid set down his own fork, giving his father his full attention. This is about Margaret, isn't it? When Rashid nodded, Khalid sighed. We weren't fair to her. Faisal, Noor and I, we were angry when you remarried so quickly after Mother died. We took it out on Margaret, and we made your marriage harder than it needed to be. The admission clearly cost him. I've felt guilty about that, especially after the divorce. She was actually trying, and we shut her out. This was new territory for them. Honesty without diplomacy. Rashid felt something shift in their dynamic. "I made mistakes too," he said. "Many mistakes. I should have defended her more, should have insisted you all give her a real chance. But more than that, I should have been a better husband. I was so busy trying to maintain everyone's approval that I neglected the person I'd actually married." "Why are you telling me this?" Khalid asked, though his tone suggested he was glad his father was. "Because I ran into Margaret a few days ago. She's pregnant, happy, building a life with someone who apparently knows how to actually show up for her." Rashid's voice was tight with emotion. "And seeing her like that made me realize I've spent 62 years building an empire, but failing at the most basic human things. Connection, vulnerability, presence. I don't want to spend the next 20 years the same way." The confession hung between them, raw and honest in a way their relationship had never been. Khalid reached across the table and did something he hadn't done since childhood. He took his father's hand. "Then don't," he said simply. "It's not too late, Father, but you have to actually do the work. You can't just decide to be different. You have to learn new behaviors, new patterns. Have you thought about therapy?" The suggestion would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Therapy was for weak people with problems they couldn't handle themselves, or so Rashid had always believed. But sitting across from his son, being offered genuine support instead of judgment, he reconsidered. "No," he admitted. "But maybe I should." The words felt foreign but not entirely uncomfortable. "Your mother," he said, referencing Layla, "did she ever want more from me? Emotionally, I mean." It was a question he'd never asked, perhaps afraid of the answer. Khalid considered his response carefully. "I think Mother accepted what you could give. She came from the same traditional background, believed in the same ideas about marriage as partnership rather than romance. But yes, I think she wanted more. I remember her crying sometimes when she thought we couldn't hear. Father, you were a good provider and a good father in practical ways, but you were distant. We all felt it." The words hurt precisely because they were true. Rashid had been distant with Layla, with his children, with Margaret. Distance had been his default mode, his protection against vulnerability. "I want to be better," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I want to learn." The admission was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to his son in decades. Khalid squeezed his hand once more before releasing it. "Start small," he suggested. "Talk to someone, a therapist who specializes in this kind of thing. Read books, ask questions, and maybe most importantly, stop seeing emotions as weaknesses. They're not. They're what make us human, what connect us to each other." He paused, then added, "And call Margaret. Thank her for whatever conversation you had that got you thinking about this. I suspect she'd appreciate knowing it made a difference." The lunch continued, but the tone had shifted. For the first time in his adult life, Rashid had been genuinely vulnerable with his son, and the sky hadn't fallen. In fact, their relationship felt stronger, more real. They talked about Khalid's children, and Rashid actually listened to the stories about their personalities and interests rather than just nodding politely. They discussed Faisal's upcoming promotion and Noor's wedding plans, and Rashid asked real questions, engaged with actual curiosity. When they parted outside the restaurant, Khalid hugged him, not the formal embrace they usually shared, but a real hug. "I'm proud of you," Khalid said, "for recognizing this, for wanting to change. That takes courage." The words settled into Rashid's chest, warming something that had been cold for too long. That evening, Rashid did something else unprecedented. He searched for therapists specializing in emotional availability and relationship patterns. The first 3 websites made him uncomfortable with their talk of inner child work and healing wounds, but the 4th was more practical. A psychologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in helping high-achieving executives develop better interpersonal skills. Her approach was evidence-based, practical, focused on concrete behavioral changes rather than endless exploration of childhood trauma. Rashid sent an inquiry email, felt ridiculous, then left it sent anyway. To his surprise, Dr. Chen responded within an hour, offering a consultation appointment. 2 days later, Rashid found himself in a tastefully appointed office in Midtown, explaining to a woman half his age why a billionaire businessman didn't know how to have a real conversation. Dr. Chen was younger than Rashid expected, maybe 40, with short black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put him at ease. She didn't coddle or flatter. Instead, she asked direct questions and listened carefully to his answers. "You've identified that you have difficulty with emotional availability and presence," she said after he'd outlined his situation. "That's actually a significant step. Many people never get that far. Now the question is, what specifically do you want to change?" It was a practical question, and Rashid appreciated it. "I want to be able to have real conversations. I want to be present with people instead of always thinking 3 steps ahead to the next business move. I want to understand what I'm feeling and be able to communicate it. I want to stop seeing vulnerability as weakness." The list came more easily than expected. "Those are all achievable goals," Dr. Chen said, making notes. "But I'll be honest with you, Rashid, this will be uncomfortable work. You've spent 6 decades building emotional walls and developing coping mechanisms that have served you well in business. Taking them down will feel dangerous at first. You'll have to sit with feelings you've been avoiding for years. You'll have to practice being vulnerable with people, which will feel excruciating initially. Are you willing to do that?" She wasn't being discouraging, just honest about what the process would entail. Rashid thought about Margaret's glowing face, about Khalid's genuine hug, about the feeling of sitting alone in that restaurant, realizing he'd built a fortune but missed a life. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing," and meant it. The sessions became weekly, then twice weekly. Dr. Chen gave him homework, journaling about his feelings, practicing active listening with his assistant and business associates, calling his children to have actual conversations rather than information exchanges. The first few weeks were brutal. Rashid discovered he didn't actually know what he felt most of the time. Angry, sad, anxious, they all felt the same. A tightness in his chest, an urge to do something productive, to avoid sitting with the discomfort. Dr. Chen taught him to pause, to identify physical sensations first, then connect them to emotions. "You're not broken," she reassured him during a particularly difficult session. "You're just learning a language most people pick up as children. It's harder to learn as an adult, but not impossible." 6 weeks into therapy, Rashid did what Khalid had suggested. He called Margaret. She answered cautiously, clearly surprised to see his name on her phone. "Rashid? Hello, Margaret. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." His voice was uncertain in a way she'd rarely heard. "I wanted to thank you. Our conversation that night, it changed something for me. Made me see things I'd been avoiding for years." There was a pause. Then Margaret's voice, warm and curious. "Changed something how?" Rashid explained about the lunch with Khalid, the therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, the uncomfortable work of learning to identify and express emotions. "I'm not good at it yet," he admitted, "but I'm trying. And I wanted you to know that seeing you happy, seeing what a real partnership looks like, it gave me something to aim for. Not with you," he added quickly. "I understand that ship has sailed, but in my life generally, with my children, with whoever I might meet in the future." Margaret felt unexpected emotion well up. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "That takes real courage, Rashid, especially at our age, admitting you need to change and actually doing the work." She paused, then added, "How are your children handling this new version of you?" Rashid laughed softly, confused mostly, but also pleased, I think. "Khalid and I had lunch again yesterday, and we talked about his marriage, his fears about being a good father. Real in things. It was uncomfortable, but also good. I'm learning that discomfort isn't always bad. It was a revelation that had taken 62 years to arrive at, but better late than never." Noor called me crying last week about wedding stress, and instead of telling her to handle it and call me back when she was composed, I just listened, let her cry, told her it was okay to be overwhelmed. That's wonderful, Margaret said genuinely. And what about you? Are you dating anyone? It was a personal question, but their relationship had evolved past the point where such questions felt invasive. Rashid shook his head, then remembered she couldn't see him. No, Celeste and I ended things amicably. She deserved someone who could be present for her, and I wasn't ready. I'm focusing on myself right now, on doing this work. Dr. Chen says I need to learn to be comfortable being alone with myself before I try to be with someone else. It was advice he'd initially resisted, but had come to see the wisdom in. He'd spent his entire adult life moving from one relationship to another, never taking time to actually know himself outside the context of marriage or partnership. How's the pregnancy going? Rashid asked, shifting focus. Are you and Richard excited? He found he genuinely wanted to know, wanted to share in her happiness rather than resenting it. Margaret's voice softened. We're thrilled, terrified, but thrilled. I'm having a girl. Did I mention that? Sophia? We're going to name her Sophia Grace. The love in her voice was unmistakable. Richard's daughter Emily is planning a baby shower. His grandchildren are excited about having an aunt younger than them. She laughed at the absurdity of it. I'm going to be a mother at 58. I never imagined this would be my life. But she sounded happy about it, fulfilled in a way she never had during their marriage. I'm happy for you, Rashid said, meaning it. Truly, you're going to be a wonderful mother. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, easier than Rashid would have expected. They talked about her gallery, a new exhibition featuring contemporary Middle Eastern artists that was getting excellent reviews. They talked about his work. He was actually delegating more, spending less time at the office, prioritizing quality over quantity. Dr. Chen says I've been using work as an emotional shield, he admitted, staying busy so I don't have to feel things. So I'm trying to cut back, be more present in the moment. It was difficult for someone who'd spent decades measuring worth by productivity, but he was learning. They agreed to stay in touch. Not as friends exactly, but as people who'd shared a significant chapter of their lives and wished each other well. When they hung up, Rashid felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. 3 months later, Rashid received a text from Margaret. Sophia Grace Morrison arrived this morning. 7 lbs 3 Oz. Healthy and beautiful. Thought you'd want to know. He stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Happiness for her, a trace of sadness for what might have been, but mostly genuine joy. He texted back immediately, "Congratulations. I'm so happy for you and Richard. May she bring you endless joy." Then, on impulse, he sent flowers to the hospital, a beautiful arrangement with a card that read simply, "Wishing you all the happiness you deserve. Rashid." It was a small gesture, but it felt important. Dr. Chen had been teaching him about closure, about how to honor past relationships while moving forward, and this felt like part of that process. 6 months after his encounter with Margaret at Le Bernardin, Rashid found himself at a charity gala for Syrian refugee children, an event Margaret's gallery was co-sponsoring. He'd bought a table, partly to support the cause, and partly because he knew she'd be there. He wanted to see her, to see baby Sophia, to demonstrate that he could be supportive without wanting something in return. The ballroom was elegant, filled with Manhattan's philanthropic elite, and Rashid moved through the crowd with practiced ease. But now, when people asked about his life, he gave real answers. "I'm learning to be better at relationships," he'd say, surprising board members and business associates, working on being more present. The conversations were awkward but genuine, and he found people responded positively to his honesty. He spotted Margaret across the room, talking animatedly about her Syrian artist, while Richard stood beside her holding a baby carrier. Sophia was 6 months old now, presumably sleeping through the gala noise with the oblivious peace of infants. Rashid approached slowly, giving them time to see him coming. "Margaret, Richard," he greeted them. "Congratulations on the exhibition. The reviews have been excellent." Margaret smiled, genuine warmth in her expression. "Rashid, I'm so glad you came. Let me introduce you to Sophia." She reached into the carrier and carefully lifted out a sleeping baby, tiny, perfect, with a shock of dark hair and her mother's nose. Rashid felt his chest tighten looking at her. This could have been ours, he thought, then released the thought. It wasn't, and that was okay. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Absolutely beautiful." Richard, holding. Sophia, with practiced ease now, smiled proudly. "She's got good lungs, I can tell you that. Keeps us up half the night." But he said it with such obvious love that Rashid felt no envy, only happiness for them. "How are you doing?" Margaret asked, studying his face. "You look different, lighter somehow." Rashid smiled, a genuine expression that felt less awkward than it used to. "I'm doing well, really well. The therapy is helping. I'm learning things I should have learned decades ago, but better late than never." He paused, then added, "I wanted to thank you again. That conversation we had, it was the catalyst I needed. You and Richard both showed me what was possible if I was willing to do the work." The three of them talked for a while longer, comfortable in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. Rashid told them about his improved relationships with his children, about Noor's wedding where he'd actually cried during his father of the bride speech. Margaret shared stories about late-night feedings and the chaos of new motherhood at 58. Richard talked about his practice and how becoming a father again at 63 had changed his perspective on everything. When they parted, they did so with genuine affection, not as former lovers who'd failed, but as people who'd learned from each other and wished each other well. Rashid watched them walk away, Margaret's hand in Richard's, baby Sophia between them, and felt something. He'd never expected genuine contentment. He'd lost Margaret, yes, but in losing her, he'd found himself. And that, he was learning, was perhaps the more important discovery.